If someone asked me what I thought the most influential game of the current generation is, I would have to say Dark Souls. We're well on our ways of games that's starting to copy its design, such as Lords of the Fallen or Nioh. But I'm not talking about simply copying a Dark Souls formula, but rather its amazing innovative designs that I think are going to echo with other games for a very long time. You can say the game is pretty neato. Dark Souls is a game that can make you Gwen or Seath, depending. And the games have a lot to talk about, some of which might not make a lot of sense, unless you played the series for yourself. What I say about making... What? Praise the pun. The history of Dark Souls is well known at this point, but it's a story worth repeating. From Software was a fairly obscure game studio in the West, and not necessarily all that big in Japan either. Known mostly for the Armored Core series, they also developed games like Echo Knight, Kingsfield, and the most American game never to be released in America, Metal Wolf Chaos.
Oh, say can you say?
Mr. President, believe in your own justice.
With Demon Souls, they had hoped to compete with the ever-growing action RPG genre that was taking its hold on both sides of the hemisphere. But the development of Demon Souls was floundering. It was then that Hidetaka Miyazaki took over development. Miyazaki, by the way, had very little experience in game development. A self-proclaimed unambitious man, Hidetaka Miyazaki first started off as a planner, but stepped in the development of Demon Souls having nothing to fear because, in his own words, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure. But thankfully, Demon Souls wasn't a failure. It was Miyazaki's ideas and design choices that led the game to be both a critical and commercial success. That success later paved the way for Dark Souls and Bloodborne, and led to Miyazaki becoming the president of From Software. Miyazaki somehow managed to turn a failing game into one of the most popular series this generation. But how? Well, that's a question we're going to try to answer today. This is Design Documentaries, where we take a look at a game's design in order to discover what made a game successful or why it failed. And today we're looking at the From Software modern classic, Dark Souls. The first thing that comes to mind when you talk about Dark Souls is the game's unforgiving difficulty. The Souls series popularized the phrase and the culture of get good. What you would think is just a standoffish YouTube comment surprisingly has a lot of nuance. In a way, it symbolizes the philosophy of Dark Souls. There's no doubt that you're going to die. A lot. And death usually carries a punishment that makes the game even more difficult. So the only way you're ever going to get good is by playing, making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and developing the skills and the reflexes needed to beat the game. Dark Souls isn't here to respect your time. Instead, Dark Souls demands that you give it respect. This sort of difficulty is something that you rarely find in modern games. But in order to appreciate Souls design, you have to go back. No, even further. Even further. Further. Just a little bit more. There we go. The NES library had its fair share of difficult games. I mean, even TV Tropes calls it Nintendo Hard for a reason. From the Death Mountain section of The Adventures of Link, to Battletoads in a Turbo Tunnel level, Ninja Gaiden, Silver Surfer, Ghosts and Goblins, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Contra, Castlevania, Mega Man, even games that weren't known for their difficulty. Kickmaster, Shatterhand, Batman, Little Nemo. These games are considerably more difficult than what you would find in a modern game. This is because during the very early days of game development, a lot of developers cut their teeth on arcades. Costly arcade machines had to make their money back somehow, so the design was just to make the game incredibly difficult in order to pull those quarters out of your pockets. In fact, the whole convention of lives and continues was just a remnant of arcade design philosophy. The practice continued through consoles because it was difficult and expensive to make your game long and expansive, and easier just to make your game difficult. A high difficulty curve turned a game that you could beat in 30 minutes take up to weeks to complete. It also meant that you couldn't rent the game and beat it in a weekend. In fact, some American releases of games were made harder to combat rental stores, a practice that is banned in Japan. But as game development continued, there became less of a need to hide your game behind a brick wall of challenge. Developers wanted you to see their worlds and hear their stories, and having a challenging game was counterintuitive. Games were designed to be easier, and I'll even argue that was a positive change. Games could be more inclusive and allowed everyone, regardless of skill level, to enjoy a shared experience. And in return, that meant more copies were sold, and that funding led to bigger and better games for developers. It seemed like the transition in design philosophies was good for everyone. But beware of roads built from good intentions. The difficulty of video games continued to trend easier and easier until we crossed this event horizon where designing a challenging game was a taboo. Companies became too afraid to make difficult games because that led to fewer sales. It was then that games became laden with tutorials, regenerating health became standard, and we even had waypoint markers for linear corridors. And then it was golden tanuki suits, and eventually games just started featuring modes removing the gameplay altogether. Those of us who liked that frustrating challenge were pretty quickly forgotten. Then along came Demon's Souls, and it did what companies figured was the equivalent of corporate suicide. It was a game that was unapologetic in its difficulty. Sony only expected the game to sell around 75,000 copies, and the game was released without a lot of fanfare. Yet, Demon's Souls ended up selling over 1.7 million copies worldwide, and that was almost entirely based on word-of-mouth sales. Mostly coming from people who were starved for a challenging game, and feeling a need that many companies had seemed to have forgotten. But what if I told you the Souls series wasn't designed on a premise of being a difficult game, and that, actually, Dark Souls is probably the most inclusive, challenging game available? Hey, alright, don't get me wrong. When I play Dark Souls, I die. A lot. An exorbitant amount of deaths. But Dark Souls wasn't the only challenging game out there. In fact, there are modern games out there that are arguably more difficult. The Ninja Gaiden reboot, Devil May Cry 3, Maximo, Super Meat Boy. These games are difficult and really well received. But we also have games like Operation Darkness or F-Zero GX that were challenging but don't earn the same accolades. And challenging games are becoming increasingly more common. So it's misleading to say that Dark Souls did well just because it was hard. But if it wasn't Dark Souls being a difficult game that made it so good, what was it? There are plenty of explanations, but we'll have to sift through them. Is this what freedom feels like? What made the Souls series so good is not how difficult the games were, but how From Software designed those games around its difficulty. Think back to the early days of the NES and look at some of the hardest games on that console. Now think about why they were hard. That damn level on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was extremely difficult because you're given entirely different controls and physics to master. You had to navigate a timed maze that was difficult even if you knew what you were doing. You were punished for the slightest mistakes, and you had at most 4 tries before you had to start back from the beginning of the game. Difficult, but not fun. Double Dragon was already a pretty tough game to beat, but Double Dragon 3 is extremely punishing and offers you only 1 life for majority of the game. Battletoads, enough said, and the Famicom exclusive Takeshi's Challenge is so cryptic that it's impossible to beat without a strategy guide. And even with the strategy guide, then it's nearly impossible. But you also have games like Nintendo's Punch-Out! And Castlevania by Hitoshi Akamatsu Productions. Games which are challenging but feature a gradual curve in difficulty that allow you to learn as you play. Games like Mega Man allow you to find other ways to make the game easier if there is a spot which you're having trouble with. Even Contra by Shigeharu Umezaki Productions gave you the decency of earning 30 lives by inputting the famously known Kazuhisa Hashimoto code. So it's not just about making the games difficult, it's how you make the games difficult. The difficulty of Dark Souls is well thought out in such a way that it can be very frustrating and punishing, but also encouraging and inclusive. You're going to die. A lot. Like, an exorbitant amount of times. Like, no, seriously, why do I keep dying over and over again? Even worse, when you die, you lose all the experience and money you currently have. That comes in the form of souls. But, and I have but capitalized and bolded in my script here, you can get it back by making it to the point where you last died. It seems like a small concession from a game that tells you more often about how you no longer live than it cares to tell you about the motivation for your character. But that design choice alone encourages you to get back and fight to that point again. And then you get all your souls back plus what you gained getting there. And it encourages you to play safer and smarter. So just as long as you keep making forward progress, you would be stronger than if you would have done it right the first time. The main cause of your death will most likely be the game's combat system, which at first seems incredibly difficult, with enemies hitting you for half your health and are often placed in beginner's traps and ambushes. And while the combat system makes it easy to draw a comparison to the 3D Legend of Zelda games, the flow of combat often draws more from Punch-Out!, where effectively everyone is Bald Bull. Enemies can do a lot of damage, possibly killing you in one hit. However, what makes them so deadly isn't their attacks, but rather the intimidation. To master combat in Dark Souls, you have to also master timing and judgment. But just like Bald Bull, it's designed to make you second guess yourself. You know just how lethal the attacks can be, so it makes you want to play defensively even though the best option is usually to play aggressively. And when multiple enemies become involved, it becomes more about luring them out or using a terrain that gives you an advantage. Dark Souls, you could say, requires you to play smarter and not harder. Then, of course, some enemies are just Mike Tyson. And though it seems like Dark Souls has more in common with Shadows of Mordor than Dragon Warrior, Dark Souls is still an RPG and has everything that goes with that genre. Even if you run up against that one boss you can't beat, you can mess around with different weapons, spells, armor, and items. If that doesn't work, you can just take a different path and explore a different area, and come back later when you're stronger and have better items. Or in the absolutely worst case scenario, you can just grind your levels like you would a traditional RPG. That isn't to say that Dark Souls is by any means easy. It still requires you to learn and respect the game, but these design choices are intentionally open and inclusive. It's a game that is designed for the hardcore market just as much as it was for the more casual players seeking to play something with a little more teeth. Which leads into the next point. What if I told you it wasn't the difficulty that made Dark Souls so good, but rather something that developed out of the difficulty? As well designed and balanced the difficulty is in Dark Souls, I'd argue that isn't what made Dark Souls so influential. Fun? Absolutely. But if you spent any time on my channel, you realize the theme is kind of a fun game that never got the success it probably deserved. To find out what really made Dark Souls, we need to look inward. The most influential aspect of the Souls series is also the one thing that can be completely looked over, and that's how the game builds a community. Dark Souls, for all intents and purposes, is a single-player game. However, throughout your journey, you'll notice these ghostly-looking figures pass you by. These are players traveling by in the same area at the same time that you are. You see them resting at bonfires, you see them running around, and you see them die. A lot. An exorbitant amount of deaths. And now I don't feel so bad for dying over and over again. However, what would normally be a superfluous addition means something in Dark Souls. It gives you this feeling that you're not alone. This feeling is intensified by all the ways the game allows you to directly help each other. Throughout the game, you'll see these messages that are left by other players, sometimes offering well wishes, other times advice, or sometimes just a laugh. Players can use humanity to kindle bonfires, which gives everyone who rested at that bonfire additional Estus flask. Some miracles have resonance, which increases if another player casts the same spell in the same area. And even in the worst case scenario of being unable to defeat a boss, you can just summon another player for some jolly cooperation. And while you can be a jerk and leave misleading messages or invade and kill another player, the game doesn't reward you for it, but almost every positive action you take is rewarded. But if the game wasn't otherwise so difficult, even with these community elements implemented, it wouldn't have been as effective. There would be no reason to leave hints and messages, no reason to offer help on a boss. Dark Souls uses this design philosophy that is rarely used by even dedicated multiplayer games. By making the environment so hostile, offering this shared experience and all these benefits of working together, you encourage this brothers-in-arms mentality that gives this large amount of satisfaction of working together with a common goal in mind. There is nearly almost an instant connection between players that don't exist otherwise. So despite all the frustration, the game leads to a positive experience. Communities outside the game develop as well, and the camaraderie is enticing enough to get others interested in it, making the community grow even larger. Despite its depressing atmosphere and the feeling of dread and hopelessness it leaves you with, you feel more connected to the world around you. But what if I told you that wasn't it either? We haven't even mentioned the deep and storied lore of Dark Souls. It doesn't try to shove a narrative down your throat, but instead requires you to explore the world and be observant of the many interesting NPCs and item descriptions. But what if I told you that wasn't it either? I didn't even mention the genius level design that creatively opens the world as you explore, and how beautifully dismal and detailed the world building is. But what if I told you that wasn't it either? But how it led to a Dark Souls board game being made. Oh jeez. Okay. Okay, so if I were to talk about all the awesome things Dark Souls was able to accomplish, this video would never end. But the fact that Hidetaka Miyazaki and the rest of the staff at From Software did so many things right, it's nearly impossible to credit the success of Dark Souls to just one aspect. Dark Souls is very much the sum of all its parts, and worked because of the game being so aware of how each design choice built on another. And we're already seeing the designs being echoed through other games, and not just by making their games difficult. And though Dark Souls 3 is said to be the last in the series, at least for a while, who knows what other innovative designs await us in future From Software titles. With all that said, as amazing as Dark Souls is, it's left me feeling a bit crestfallen. I think it's about time I played one of my favorite games. It's time for a little fun. So until next time, this is SoberDwarf reminding you that gaining souls builds character. Well, so as long as you don't die before you get to use them. Hey, thank you very much for watching. If you're interested in catching the next video, please remember to subscribe. That way you can be notified the day the video is released. In the meantime, if you're wanting more content, you can check out my video on why games as experiences can be important. Or if Dark Souls was just a little intimidating, you can watch my Final Fantasy Mystic Quest video, where I talk about designing an entry-level RPG. Also, very special thanks to the people who donated to my Patreon. I haven't even made the announcement video yet, but already some of you are helping out. If you would like to support the show, and maybe get a few extras for your trouble, there's a link to the Patreon page in the description below. Now, if you'll excuse me, I gotta go retrieve my souls. Again. Run sober, but you can't hide forever.